If you're a long-time follower of my work, then it should be common knowledge to you that boss fights are one of my favorite elements in a game. Whether it be for their challenge factor, their creativity, their story-driven nature, or any other elements, bosses are many times my favorite part of a game. So you can imagine how much coming across a bad boss can suck. I already did a list on this topic way back when, which as far as I'm concerned was the first list of mine that was legitimately good, but since the video itself has aged drastically and the order severely dated, I feel like giving this topic a second go. You all know the rules, so there's no need to waste any more time. Let us commence! As I've said before, Sengoku Basara Samurai Heroes, for the most part, does boss fights really well. However, there is that small handful of bosses in the game that don't meet the same level of quality as the rest, and this is the most apparent with Hideaki Kobayakawa. Now, Hideaki already is one of the worst characters in the series, being a cowardly general who would much rather stuff his mouth full of food than lead an army into battle. But his boss fight just makes those traits of his even more annoying. Granted, the first portion of his battle isn't too bad, it's standard Sengoku Basara boss fashion, but it's when he gets down to half of his health that the fight gets frustrating, because Hideaki ends up running away from you and fleeing to his giant pot full of vegetables, making him inaccessible. So now you're forced to go and take over the 3 bases guarding the stove that's keeping the pot boiled just so you can turn off the stove and have Hideaki come back down to fight. Except when he comes back down, he doesn't go to fight you. Instead, he'll make his way to the stove bases and take them back. And should he take all 3 back, he'll go right back to hiding away, forcing you to take over the bases again. This means you need to chase him down and make sure he doesn't capture the bases, which would be a lot easier if it weren't for the fact that the area is coated with his men. And while yes, it is fun to bring down all these soldiers, it takes up precious time that you could be using to chase down Hideaki and attack him. So yeah, it's no wonder I always find myself going down the Tenkai route whenever I go to siege at Karasu Castle. Coincidentally enough, Tenkai happens to be one of the best bosses in the game. My favorite in the game, actually. It's like the developers knew or something. Can we honestly just agree that no one was expecting Kid Icarus Uprising to be the game that it turned out to be? I mean, from that first trailer at E3 2010, would anyone have been able to predict that this game would be so full of witty writing and hilarious characters? Though to be fair, I think keeping that sort of stuff under wraps was a good idea, because it certainly made the game that much better of an experience. Or at least, for the most part. While a lot of the game is great, this game also has the pointless Aura Mark, which contains some of the game's worst elements, like the atrocious protection mission in Chapter 17, and, coincidentally in the same chapter, the worst boss in the game. In all fairness, any of the bosses from the Aura Mark could have made it onto this list, as they all suck. But Aurum Pyron is by far the worst one of them all. Right when the battle begins, Pyron has himself protected by an energy shield, so you can't do any damage to him. Instead, you need to destroy these green lights at the edge of the arena in order to bring his shield down. And once they're gone, you can just wail away at Pyron like you would any other boss. Actually, that's not 100% true, because Pyron's arsenal of attacks will force you to almost never stand still, with special mention going to his fire ring that requires you to use the jump pad to avoid, which is honestly easier said than done. Timing's a little tricky to do. Not even the dialogue in this battle is that good, and that's usually a saving grace for a lot of the bosses in the game. Instead, the deities just give off exposition about the destructive nature of the Aurum, something that the game's been hammering into our heads for the previous 3 chapters. And when they're not saying anything, Pyron's making bizarre, robot-like statements. Though him opening the fight by saying kill in binary was a nice touch. Besides that, this fight's just a disappointing end to an already disappointing story arc. Good thing the best story arc in the game starts up in the following chapter. In the case of a lot of games that are rather infamous for their difficulty, usually the toughest bosses are saved for later on in the game, which makes perfect sense. It's a good way to show progression. After all, why have one of the hardest bosses in your game be pretty much right out the gate? Well, clearly Capcom didn't get the memo when making the first Mega Man Zero game, because Aztec Falcon is by far one of the most difficult bosses in the game, and not at all in a good way. His attack pattern mostly consists of shooting electrified feathers at you in order to keep you from getting up close with your Z-Saber, but his ability to release electricity onto the floor or pull you in with an electrified magnet certainly doesn't help. Now, if this boss was present later on in the game, this wouldn't be as big of an issue. But the problem is that this is basically the game's first boss, and with pretty much no upgrades available for you at this point, it makes the fight far too hard for this early on. But if all of that wasn't bad enough, the platform you're standing on has spikes on the bottom, and it's slowly closing in on a resistant soldier trapped at the bottom, which means this boss is on a time limit, and they barely give you enough time to bring down Aztec Falcon. Fortunately, this fight isn't as difficult in the easy scenario on the Zero Collection, since that version of the game gives you fully upgraded weapons right from the get-go, so you can actually get some considerable damage in on Aztec Falcon pretty quickly. But if you're playing the original, good freaking luck! If there's one thing you should know about me, it's that I'm very hit or miss when it comes to patience. And one area where my patience isn't very thick is when it comes to movement in video games. If I'm forced to use something or someone that naturally moves slowly, I'm probably not going to be in the greatest of moods. So imagine having to deal with a boss with relatively fast-moving attacks while you're forced to move at an exceedingly slow pace. Actually, no, you don't have to imagine it, because that's pretty much the Komodo Brothers fight from Crash Bash in a nutshell. Now, some of you may recognize this boss as one of the frontrunners from my original least favorite bosses list. And believe it or not, this is actually the only boss from the original list on this one. Told you that original order was severely dated. However, even after the last 3 years, my hatred for this battle hasn't gone away. As I said earlier, the biggest problem with this fight comes from how slow the tank is compared to how fast the shots from the Komodo Brothers' bunker weapons are. It's even worse in the second phase of the fight, as you're pitted into a 1-on-2 battle with both Komodo Brothers, both of which have fast-moving laser shots available to use against you. Fighting just one of them is hard enough as it is, but two is just ridiculous. There's really not much left to say except that if the game's infamous "you fail" audio clip wasn't ingrained into your mind beforehand, this battle will get that job done very quickly. Unless you're somehow a beast with the tank. And if that's the case, please teach me your ways. So last year, I got a chance to play through the popular indie platformer Super Meat Boy, and I gotta say, I can see why this game's such a big hit. The whole thing people say about how the game is made in a way where you really get angry at the game for your mistakes really is true for the most part. And hey, it's a really solid platformer. Sadly, the same can't be said for its boss battles, as none of them are really that good. And before you ask, no, I'm not picking Little Horn. Yes, he barely telegraphs his attacks, but because the attack pattern is exactly the same each time, it can actually become one of the easier bosses of the game once you've got the pattern down. Coincidentally enough, though, the boss I'm picking has the exact polar opposite issues, which is where I introduce you to Larry's Lament. The main goal of this battle is to have the 3 giant maggot things each jump at you and for you to get them to jump into the saw blades at the edge of the arena. Once you do that to all 3 of them, the battle ends. However, the issue is that, while they telegraph their attacks quite well, you'll never know what attack they'll use, and you need them to do the leap attack in order to kill them. So there's actually a chance you could find yourself playing the waiting game for a very long time, hoping that they'll just jump already. In other words, the battle becomes less of a test of skill and more of a test of patience, especially since their attacks are relatively easy to avoid, and there's a section behind the saw blades that you can hide in, which will make it pretty much impossible for them to attack you. And people think that Little Horn is worse? Sometimes you really can't let someone else's opinion on something hinder your thoughts on it. Courtesy of a few members of the Countdown community, I had a negative outlook on Secret of Mana for quite a while, but when I finally played it with some friends in high school, I was actually pleasantly surprised. It really is a fun game, especially when playing with friends. However, much like with Super Meat Boy, this game's not very strong when it comes to its bosses. And while the Mantis Ant is a prominent example of how bad these bosses can get, I'd say the one that my friends and I hated fighting the most during our playthrough of the game would be the Wallface. And yes, I know that's a dumb name for a boss, but believe me, that's the least of your worries with this. In this battle, your main goal is to destroy the Wallface's 3 eyes, but it's not as simple as that. In the first half of the fight, you want to put your focus on destroying its 2 main eyes, as destroying the 3rd eye in this phase is pretty much pointless. The first problem here is that the eye's hitboxes are very inconsistent. Sometimes you hit the eye right at the same spot as before, but it may not register the fact that you hit it. At the same time, the Wallface has got some pretty devastating magic attacks that, like with many other bosses in the game, are unavoidable. And while this part is certainly really bad, the second part just makes things even worse. Once both main eyes are destroyed, the Wallface will start moving in on you, and now you need to destroy the 3rd eye before the Wallface crushes you, which will cause an instant game over if it succeeds. Unfortunately, the only real efficient way to damage the 3rd eye is with offensive magic, which only one of your party members has. So you better hope he didn't waste his magic on the eyes in the first phase, otherwise you're pretty much done for. Oh yeah, the eyes can also heal themselves, forgot to mention that. So yeah, this boss is pretty infuriating, and it perfectly captures everything wrong with the bosses in Secret of Mana. The feels weird thinking about the fact that one of the greatest challenges for these soon-to-be legendary heroes is literally a wall with eyes. Imagine if that made it into the history books. That'll make for one hilarious history class. Oh boy, I get to talk about Sonic Lost World again. Goodness, this game was such a disappointment. I legit thought this game had a chance to be really good. And looking how it turned out, there's definitely signs of a good game hidden in here. But sadly, Sega just missed the goal line. Really unfortunate too, considering Sonic had just gotten back onto his feet courtesy of Generations. So yeah, Lost World was a disappointment, and one of the elements behind that was the boss fights. Only a select few were any good, and those that were bad were really bad. But funny enough, even though a Lost World boss took the #1 spot on my worst Sonic bosses list from 2014, that being the Xenofight from the 3DS version, that's actually not the boss I'm going to be talking about on this segment. Because how could anyone call Xena the worst boss in the same game that has the Zor battle? out of all the bosses on this list, this one is quite easily the most painful one, and I don't mean figuratively. The main gimmick of this battle is that Zor will fly away atop his giant owl robot and hide amongst several fake owl robots. And it's your goal to shoot yourself at the right one using a cannon in the middle of the arena. Thing is, Zor's charging a powerful attack during this, so you're on a time limit to find the right one. Hit the right one and you get a chance to damage Zor. Now this isn't actually the biggest problem with the fight. That comes from the cannon controls. What's the problem with the cannon controls, you ask? Quite simple. The cannon's controlled with the 3DS's gyroscope. In other words, tilting it. Now this may not seem like too big of an issue. After all, other 3DS games use gyroscope controls like this. Heck, Kirby Triple Deluxe has them for cannon controls as well, and they were fine there. But here's the thing. The robots surround you from all directions, so the game expects you to be able to turn your 3DS in all directions. Now imagine doing this boss fight while you're on a road trip, because that's when I fought this boss. You have no idea how uncomfortable it was having to twist my body around while seatbelted into a seat just so I can hit the boss. Look, I have no problem with using the gyroscope for a boss like this, but this is not how it should be executed. And if that weren't bad enough, there's a rematch with Zor in the final world of the game. Ain't that just wonderful? So Devil May Cry 3, by far the best game I played in 2015 and easily one of my favorite games. And I mean it, we're talking top 3 material here. It's an insanely fun hack and slash with a simple but effective story, fantastic characters, beyond satisfying combat, and for the most part some really great boss battles. Granted, not all of its bosses are this level of quality, but a lot of the bosses are phenomenal. Some of them being some of my favorite bosses in any video game. So let's stop beating around the bush and get to talking about why I hate the battle against Arkham. To those who don't know, Arkham's one of the main antagonists of the game, serving alongside Virgil in his mission to open the portal between the human and demon worlds. However, while Virgil's doing this in an attempt to gain enough power to destroy the demon king Mundus, Arkham's actually been secretly plotting to use these events to his advantage and obtain the power of Dante and Virgil's father, the legendary demon Sparda. Cut to later in the game, and Arkham has managed to open the demon world and gain Sparda's power. And Dante confronts the now all-powerful Arkham. But with this power combined with Arkham's corrupt soul, he transforms into a giant blob monster, which brings us to this awful battle. Now this boss fight consists of 2 phases, and right from the first phase, it's pretty evident why this boss isn't too great. Arkham's attacks are insanely strong, and taking a hit from him can be quite devastating. And that's just his normal attacks. Things only get worse when Arkham hides away and summons an army of demon leeches. And holy crap, these leeches are annoying to deal with! You're pretty much required to use the rocket launcher to survive this part, as they like to surround you and swarm you all at once. But even with the rocket launcher, it could still be a pain to kill them all. However, while this first phase is pretty annoying, it is nothing compared to the second phase. Once Arkham's down to half health, Virgil comes in and decides to help you fight Arkham. And realistically, this should be seen as an upgrade. I mean, now you've got Virgil fighting alongside you. Where do you go wrong with that? Well, quite simply, actually. You see, in Devil May Cry 3, there's this mechanic called style, and the style you choose changes what the circle button does in-game. During my playthrough of the game, the style I used for pretty much all of it was the Trickster style, which gives you the ability to dash. And in my opinion, dashing is a much more efficient way to avoid attacks than regular dodging. However, in the second phase of the Arkham battle, the circle button is now used to call Virgil over to you, which not only is a really pointless feature, but that also means that the game completely throws away your previous style for the sake of this. So imagine how I felt when the mechanic I used to avoid attacks was taken away from me for something that really isn't that useful. It's a good thing that the fantastic Virgil fight in the Demon World took place after this. Arkham would have made an absolutely terrible final boss. Oh, wonderful. Time to talk about Yu Yevon again. I know, I've already gone on a tangent about this boss on my top 10 worst Final Fantasy bosses list, so I'll try my hardest not to drag this out and sound like a broken record. So what exactly is so wrong with this boss? Well, for starters, all your party members have permanent auto life, meaning it's literally impossible for you to die in this fight. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Yu Yevon constantly heals himself during this battle, whether it be by his own hand or by the Yu Pagodas. However, Yu Yevon's not immune to the zombie status, so with a single zombie attack, you can either have him kill himself with his healing or just throw a Phoenix down at him for an instant kill. Alternatively, you can have him kill himself with his signature move Gravija, which is able to do damage to himself while keeping the Yu Pagodas incapacitated. Or you can use a Candle of Life to inflict doom on him, which will kill him 3 turns later. In other words, this is a really underwhelming battle, especially for a final battle. But oddly enough, since my first rant on Yu Yevon, I've actually seen people defend him, saying that the battle was supposed to be underwhelming. As I remember one person describing it, the irony of this supposed almighty creature that's been putting Spira in a state of suffering for centuries being this pathetic is like the scene in Wizard of Oz where the wizard's fraud nature is unveiled. Now I understand that, and on a story perspective, yes, Yu Yevon's actually quite effective. However, the reason it works better in something like Wizard of Oz than it does in Yu Yevon's case is because Final Fantasy X isn't a movie. It's a video game. A story-driven video game, yes, but a video game nonetheless, so gameplay still needs to be brought into play, which makes a message like this a lot harder to pull off. Honestly, if you ask me, video games should never have to sacrifice gameplay for the sake of a message. Ever. It's absolutely possible to get an effective message across without sacrificing gameplay. In fact, some games use the gameplay to their advantage to help get the point across. But Yu-Yevon pushing gameplay aside for the purpose of getting a message across just doesn't work. Chances are people aren't going to be thinking of your message when dealing with a boss like this. They're probably going to be thinking about how crappy the boss is. And judging how much people refer to Braska's Final Aeon as the true final boss of the game, I think my statement is relatively accurate. The point I'm trying to get at is that if you're going to implement a message of sorts into your video game, don't sacrifice gameplay for the sake of it. In other words, don't make a boss bad on purpose. Nobody likes bad bosses. Out of all the game genres out there that usually implement boss battles, fighting games is probably the most infamous for their bosses. I mean, I totally get why fighting game bosses are so difficult. Great way to eat up quarters is to have a boss that the player wants to try over and over again to beat. But holy crap, some of these fighting game developers go completely nuts with how cheap they make their bosses. Because of this, there's really a lot of choices from the fighting game genre that could fit for a list like this. But if you ask me, there's one boss in particular that stands high above the rest. And not in a good way.
The mark of my dignity shall scar thy DNA.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Gil, leader of the Illuminati, self-proclaimed messiah, and the main antagonist of the Street Fighter 3 games. He serves as the final boss of all 3 versions of SF3, and he's a real pain in the neck in each game. But it's in the 3rd version, that being Third Strike, that he's at his absolute worst. As to be expected with a final boss in a fighting game, Gil hits like a truck, with his attacks doing considerable damage even when blocked. But while that's where the problems end with a lot of fighting game bosses, that's just the tip of the iceberg in Gil's case. Gil also has a projectile attack, which not only changes its element depending on which direction he's facing, but they go through your own projectiles, so Hadouken spamming won't save you in this case. Granted, I highly doubt you'd even be able to make it to Gil if you did nothing but Hadouken spamming, but I digress. However, Gil's worst traits have yet to be brought up. In Third Strike, every character has 3 different super arts available, but you have to select which one you'll be able to use in the match before it begins. Gil is the exception to this rule. He can use all 3 of his supers in a single match, and all 3 of them are living nightmares. His first super, entitled Meteor Strike, has him summon a barrage of cryokinetic and pyrokinetic meteors from the sky to pummel you. But that's child's play compared to his second super, Seraphic Wing, which is an attack that covers the entire screen and is not only impossible to avoid, but it's also impossible to parry. Meaning the only thing you can do to prevent it from destroying you is blocking. But even then, it'll still do a ludicrous amount of damage. Now these are all pretty big reasons behind why Gil's such an infamous boss among the lineup fighting games have provided, but what puts him at the top of this list for me is without a doubt the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen added to a fighting game boss. To put it simply, if you KO Gil while his super art gauge is full, he'll use his 3rd super art, which restores him to full health. Granted, you're able to interrupt the resurrection attack, but that's beyond easier said than done. So long story short, it's pretty evident why Gil is one of the first names that come to many minds of the fighting game community when cheapest fighting game bosses are brought up. Again, fighting game bosses are known to be hard, but Capcom took it a little too far with Gil. All we can hope is that they've learned from this mistake. I'm the One-Winged Angel, and I think even Capcom knew how ridiculously unfair Gil was to fight, because after enough consecutive losses to him, he'll start laughing mid-match, which is actually the game's sign of the difficulty dropping. And yes, it does make the fight easier, but at the same time, it's pretty humiliating knowing that the game has to lower the difficulty for you just so you can win.